Picture a cramped bedroom above a bakery in a quiet French suburb. Posters on the wall, a battered PC humming, a teenager hunched over a screen with a cigarette-smudged keyboard, and a grin that never quite leaves his face. This is not a film set. This is the start of a very odd chapter in the history of modern scams. The kid who built a fake FBI website and convinced thousands it was real. His name was Anthony Zboralski. Online, he went by a name that sounded harder than he was anthrax. In the mid-1990s, Anthony was in his late teens, living in France, obsessed with phones, bulletin boards, and the growing wilds of the internet. He loved two things: messing with systems and watching people walk right into the traps he set. The web then was more like the frontier than a polished tool. Official-looking pages were easy to mimic. Trust was instant, and most people had no idea what a URL even was. Governments had little presence online, and the sight of an official seal on a web page carried disproportionate weight. If you knew how to copy an image and paste a warning, you could become an authority, at least on someone's browser. Anthony saw an opportunity in that blind faith. He didn't start by building a fake FBI site with some grand criminal mastermind plan. He started with curiosity and a prankster's appetite. He noticed how, in America, the FBI's seal and stern language made ordinary people submit forms, statements, money, compliance. It flicked something in him. What would happen if a stranger put that seal on a website, wrote a convincing letter, and told people they were under investigation? So he built one. Not an elaborate deep net forgery, not a bypass of security protocols, just a web page that looked official. Seal, bold warnings, legal-sounding paragraphs, and a form. He wrote with a voice that sounded bureaucratic and used phrases that made people slow down and listen. Then he did something more brazen. He linked a phone number to the page. Not a normal line, but a premium rate line. A hotline that charged callers a high fee per minute, the kind of number advertisers used for votes and psychic readings. He launched the site and watched. What followed was the simple human thing that terrifies anyone who studies scams. People obey the symbols of authority. Calls came in. Some were frightened parents. Some were small business owners. Many were people who knew little about the internet, but had seen news about fraud and thought they might be cooperating. They typed personal information into the form, believing they were reporting to a federal agency. Others dialed the number and, on the other end, reached a voice that sounded official enough to reassure them. There were two kinds of losses in this scam. The first was emotional humiliation, fear, the feeling that a state-level agency was investigating you. The second was financial. Because the phone line was premium rate, every minute cost money. Anthony's little setup siphoned off hundreds of thousands of francs and dollars in small increments. For many victims, the amount was humiliating rather than ruinous. For others, it was a shocking bite taken out of a tight budget. But why a teen? Why would someone so young go after the FBI? For Anthony, it wasn't an ideological act or a political statement. It was a mix of mischief, experimentation, and the rush of proving how fragile our respect for authority can be. He loved the game of deception, creating an official-looking object and watching real citizens respond as if that object were law. The fake FBI site also exposed another truth. The internet of the 90s had no reliable mechanism to validate authority. There were no verified badges, no secure government domains, no public awareness about spoofing. If you could copy a logo and pick the right words, you could carry the voice of a nation. News of the scam didn't explode overnight. It grew in the old-fashioned way. Complaints trickled into telephone companies. Victims talked to friends, and a few journalists picked up the thread. Eventually, law enforcement got a pattern. A premium number with an unusual traffic spike tied to an apparently official-looking website. But the trail led overseas, and cross-border digital investigations were still a clumsy business. Getting to Anthony required the kind of patient, imperfect detective work that would look quaint today. Telecom records, help from overseas providers, and a few lucky breaks pointed investigators to a French ISP. From there, an inquiry into the registered contact for the site revealed a lead. It wasn't dramatic. It was paperwork and fumbles, and a teenager who didn't think his little site would result in such a fuss. When the door finally opened on Anthony's apartment, the search turned up the artifacts of the age: floppy disks, a manual for web design, hand-drawn flowcharts of how his phone line worked, and printouts of the site. There was no lair of villains, no bank vault of stolen data. There was a young man who had underestimated the reach of his prank. The legal response had to balance novelty and precedent. This wasn't a classical bank robbery, but it was fraud. Authorities charged him under existing laws, sometimes stretching language to fit a new kind of harm. For Anthony, the consequences were serious. Criminal charges, a small but public scandal, and a sharp lesson in the fact that what feels like a prank can become a crime when other people's money and trust are involved. But the story doesn't end with arrests and courtroom files. The tiny scandal sparked something far larger: awareness. Companies started to think about how official logos and legal phrasing could be mimicked. Telecoms began to scrutinize premium rate numbers and how they were associated with web content. For the public, it became a slow, awkward education. Not every stern-looking page is what it claims to be. Anthony's case sits in a category of early internet crimes that we now recognize as social engineered fraud. It didn't require complex code or stealthy infiltration. It required a mirror, a convincing tone, and the willingness of humans to obey an apparent authority. That's a lesson that cybersecurity schools and corporate training programs still teach. The weakest link is usually the human who answers the phone. There's also an argument, one you'll hear from hackers and cautious security experts, that cases like Anthony's accelerated the professionalization of cybersecurity. When a teenager could make a mock government page and pocket cash from strangers, clients asked the hard question: how do we prove that we are who we say we are online? That question eventually led to verified domains, better consumer education, and slowly, an infrastructure that makes spoofing harder, though not impossible. Another angle worth pausing on: the cultural difference in the reaction. In some communities, a prankster who exposes gullibility becomes a folk hero. In others, the focus is on the harm. Anthony's motives were never purely malicious, but they were recklessly indifferent to consequences. That duality, mischief versus damage, is central to many stories in the cyber era. After the dust settled, Anthony largely vanished from headlines. Some stay in the tech world, others go quiet, and a few pivot. There are accounts that, later in life, some people involved in early hacks used their skills for legitimate work, eventually joining the defense side, teaching companies how to be secure. But whether Anthony took that path or not, the scar his page left on the net mattered. If you look at the broader arc, the fake FBI site was an early signpost. It said, plainly, official-looking things on the internet can be counterfeit. That insight paved the way for large-scale phishing, business email compromise, and the cascade of impersonation scams that have cost individuals, companies, and governments billions. Think of this case as a seed. From that seed grew legal frameworks, telecom monitoring, and new forms of digital forensics. For many, it was the moment they realized the web required more than enthusiasm. It required guardrails. But what about the victims? Among the thousands who called or clicked, some were embarrassed into silence, some reported the loss, and some used it as a cautionary tale. The emotional damage was subtle but real. A diminished trust in institutions, an extra nod of paranoia when dealing with official communications. When the state is impersonated, people's confidence in actual authorities can take a hit. There's an almost cinematic irony in imagining a teenage prankster teaching a world of executives and regulators how fragile their trusted symbols could be. That's the tightrope early cyber miscreants walked. Their acts were often small in scope, but large in consequence. So what's the takeaway? First, the internet amplified the old human tendency to obey symbols of authority. Second, technology made it trivial to manufacture those symbols. Third, the solution is as much cultural as it is technical. Teach people to ask questions, verify claims, and understand that a seal on a web page isn't proof of jurisdiction. And one final thought about the kid from the bakery apartment. People like Anthony force a society to learn, not because they intended to be teachers, but because their mischief exposes gaps. Some students of cyber history will say that these small, ugly experiments were painful but useful. The price we paid to learn new forms of harm and how to patch them. If you want to trace that line straight to today, the same human impulses that made Anthony's sting work now power spear phishing campaigns that take down companies, political disinformation operations that manipulate voters, and scams that empty retirement accounts. The actors change, the scale grows, but the pattern remains eerily consistent. The teen who built a fake FBI website wasn't a mastermind of industrial crime. He was a mirror held up to a trusting public. He showed, in blunt terms, how easily authority can be copied and how readily people submit. And once you see that mirror, you can choose to look away or to learn. In the quiet aftermath, the world learned. People started checking URLs. Telecoms tightened oversight on premium numbers. Journalists wrote warnings. Schools and companies taught basic digital hygiene. Those are small victories, and they're never complete. But they exist because someone with a taste for mischief pointed out a glaring problem. The story also leaves a question that lingers. If a teenager in a French flat could impersonate an American law enforcement agency and cause measurable harm, what happens when the tools get easier and the incentives get higher? The answer is, the reason you see entire industries dedicate themselves to trust and verification online. When we close the book on Anthony's chapter, we don't get a neat moral about punishment or redemption. We get a sharper awareness that trust on the internet is a fragile thing, and that every symbol, seal, logo, official-sounding paragraph should be treated as suspect until verified. That's the lesson the fake FBI site handed us. Unwrapped like a prank, but heavy with consequence. If you liked this video, subscribe to Dark Protocol to watch videos on cybercrimes that no one talks about.